Well, we're about to go on a journey, a region of the world that includes India, Nepal, Tibet, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Thailand, even China, Japan, Korea. Among these traditions that have really plumbed the depths of human consciousness and developed kind of the contemplative practices and explorations. But how did we get there? How did we get here to where we are now talking about and examining these different things that lead us on a path to what we call enlightenment or awakening? So to give some context here, I wanted to just share the story with you. Religions of India. Cool image, right? I love this picture.
Are you studying with?
So if we go back to roughly about 1800 BCE, before Common Era, some people think it was much earlier. But at this, in sort of northern India, the Indus Valley up in northern India, which is now India. It wasn't called India back then. Before it was India, it was Hindustan, I believe. And before that, it was regions. It was like provinces and regions ruled usually by royalty. But there was a period that we call the Vedic period. And this is some of the earliest known texts of the Hindu religions, the Hindu traditions that we know about. Interestingly, the earliest artifact that we have is a sort of form of the god Shiva, who is sometimes called the destroyer. But there are sort of traditions and lineages that honor Shiva as sort of the ubiquitous absolute principle on a clay pot. It was the earliest known artifact, which is interesting because he was in the lotus position or Padmasana, and yet yoga was not going to be coming around here for another probably 1,000 years. So there are some sort of questions about dates and all of that. And different scholars may argue kind of different time periods for different things. So keeping that in mind, there was an original creation myth around this period that there was a great being called Prajapati, who was like a conscious, divine, God-like being. And that Prajapati began to come apart. His various limbs started to break away. And those various limbs actually eventually became the different segments of society, the castes. This is one reason why the caste system in India and other parts of that region are so hard to eradicate, because they have these deep roots all the way back in the Vedic period. So there's a lot at stake for the Brahmin, the caste, the highest priestly caste that still exists in India. Nevertheless, there were these texts, 4 Vedas. We're not going to go through each one, that would take too long. But these Vedas were largely instructions in the form of songs, what we call hymns, that were largely designed to keep the cosmic order together in a state of balance. And of course, that also meant the social order too. The idea was that if you propitiate, appease the gods, not just Prajapati, but this pantheon of beings out there, then everything will be well in the cosmos, that the natural order of things will be maintained. But you had to recite these Vedas, or these texts, just right. So this is one of the reasons that we still have them to this day. They were, after all, not written, they were passed down orally, but they had to be recited just so. Long lineage of recitation. the Rig Veda, probably the earliest. Some of them articulated rituals with soma leaves, fire rituals, pujas, homa fires. And these were also rituals burning sacred wood to make sure that the cosmos was in balance. The ones who developed these ways of doing it were called rishis. Now, usually you will see this word written this way in the Sanskrit. That's a rishi. And what the word literally means is seer, those who could see into the nature of things. So we already have kind of a contemplative, almost mystical. Last week we talked a lot about contemplation and mysticism through William James. These mystics, if you will, were really kind of the authority to determine what the state of things were like in the universe and the cosmos and in this world. So all of this happened roughly between 1800 and 1000 BCE, before the Common Era. And so here we have basically rituals were performed by the priestly caste, the highest caste, the four varnas or castes, in order to maintain the cosmos by regular, what we would call nowadays worship ceremonies, burning fires. Here we see an image of a woman praying to two statues of Ganesh, the elephant god, actually the progenitor of Shiva and Parvati in the pantheon, and Hanuman, the monkey god, who represents just profound loyalty. A lot of these there were sacrifices of soma leaves, as I mentioned earlier. And in some places, they would sacrifice animals and rituals, those kinds of things. All of this was designed, again, to keep the macrocosm in balance. So when we look at the macrocosm of this period, the beliefs in all that is out there that needs to be propitiated, we also are seeing sort of moral conduct as being extremely important to maintaining that. So there we also have sort of a priority of good conduct, of being happy in your place, your station in life, that kind of thing. We also have this belief in that begins to take shape as the years progress, that the macrocosm is also defined by two principles. So here we see a dualism forming. The notion of pure consciousness in the form of Purusha. Purusha is that being of what we can call divine consciousness, represented by utter stillness, balance, clarity, wakefulness. And Prakriti. Prakriti is one way of translating nature. It is basically the material form, the nature, the natural manifestation of the cosmos and all the things within it. And that's also part of the macrocosm here. So we have these two very distinct principles of pure consciousness in the male and energy and nature and manifestations in the female, creation. Okay? So around 1000 BCE, to about 300 BCE. And again, these dates, if you do research on this, you'll find a lot of variations here. But when I was in college and when I was learning from Barbara Holdridge, who's still an incredible scholar of Hindu traditions, this is kind of accepted in the scholarly realm, in my experience. There is this period called the Upanishadic period, or focused on texts called the Upanishads. This is sort of the precursor of what some of you may understand as the foundation under yoga and also Advaita Vedanta. And basically what characterizes this period, and also the texts that start emerging here, is that the outer sacrifice, so the sacrificial process of maintaining the cosmos, the macrocosm, starts moving inward. It starts moving into what we might call the self, the inner microcosm of the macrocosm. Basically, that the body becomes a microcosm of the great cosmos. And so exploring here, not just Purusha and Prakriti, but also consciousness within what we might call the mind body, but basically the divine that exists in the cosmos that is within us. And so here's where people would go into the forests and they would study with these great masters who would show them what they had realized about these texts. There are teachings, the Upanishads, there are quite a few of them. Some of them are stories and also wisdom of how one deals with one's own experiences in the world and within their own inner life, how to transcend this world into a supreme form of consciousness, to unification with the absolute, which we come to know as Brahman, small b. And so the inner cosmos, this is what we call post-Vedic. So it's moving now from the Vedic period and the texts into the sort of the inner explorations. We find other texts like the Hatha Yoga Upanishad, which is where Hatha Yoga, the original form of what we now know as yoga, originated in a much simpler way, as well as the Kundali Upanishad, where the subtle physiology of the body and Kundalini is explicated, again, in a kind of a very sort of a rudimentary way. And a lot of that has to do with keeping the body healthy. You know, what do you drink? There's this notion of like sticking a rag up in your nose and bringing it out the other side. You know, all these texts to purify the body. And all of this was done through experimentation and probably drawing on prior medicinal things from the natural world. Anyway, it's a very significant shift here. So at this period, during this Upanishadic period, which really kind of got going, again, 1000 BCE to about 800 BCE, people would go into the forests. And this is where this would happen. The contemplative life was really starting to codify itself in the form of texts, teachings about consciousness and so on. That there are these three principles that were really the heart of these traditions at that time. The notion of Brahman, so Brahman, Lord, divine, the absolute, God. There are many names for this being. Another term called Atman. Atman is that aspect of the divine that is within us. So remember, there is this microcosm of the macrocosm. So Brahman represents just the pure, absolute, conscious, divine being of the macrocosm. Atman is that aspect of it within us. So that there is, in essence, what we might call spirit in the West. We have this pneuma, this spirit within us that is part of the great divine being. Slightly different from perhaps the Catholic theology that says God is out here and it's the Holy Spirit that we are able to bring into this body, into this mind, but that it is of something outside of us. But here it's a little different. The theology is more that all things are Brahman, including that aspect of spirit, if you will, that is within us. We have this spark, if you will. And then there's a third term called Rit, or Rita. This is kind of an interesting one here. There are different ways to spell this. I think here we have this term Rishi, Rit. This is actually, more, this is actually closer to the original spelling, Rita. This is the third principle, basically, that Rita is that fundamental order of things in the cosmos. Basically, it's a process. It's not a thing, but it's a process that involves gati, which means, here it means continual movement or change. In other words, all things are in constant change all the time. 2, samgatna, interdependence, that all things aren't just in change, but they're also mutually interdependent. We can start seeing a bit of where the Buddha might have gotten some of his own kind of realizations about the nature of impermanence and interdependence. And niyati, the inherent process that includes both of them. In other words, constant change and mutual interdependence are basically happening simultaneously. These are one and the same. This process is ubiquitous for all things that exist. And you find this cosmic order actually all the way back in the Vedas as well. It's the truth of the cosmos, and interestingly, morality is a part of this. Conduct, how we are with each other, how we are in the world. So anyway, these things are pretty integral here, in that this process of rit or rita actually is really key to binding together what comes later in the Upanishads with the early Vedic period. So it's not that these are necessarily separate. Now, if we move into a little further into these ideas, Brahman, or the divine or God, has 2 forms. And there's what's called Saguna Brahman, which means the divine can be conceptualized. The divine or the absolute appearing in forms with qualities, with conceptual traits. In other words, relative. And so it's understood that Saguna Brahman has manifestations. Yeah? There are images. There are ways to talk about Saguna Brahman, in that Saguna Brahman has characteristics. And then we come to Nirguna Brahman. Nirguna Brahman is the absolute that is formless, without any attributes at all. And it is inconceivable. This is what we can call ultimate reality. The problem that humans get into here is seeing Saguna Brahman as Nirguna Brahman, seeing the forms as ultimate reality. So it was very important during this period to say, great, we have this relative way that we talk about and we worship and we do these things, but the absolute, this is not literally the absolute. Because the absolute is fundamentally formless and without traits. Now, Atman, the aspect of Brahman within us, that is what we call self, with a capital S, because it is divine. Again, what we might call spirit. Yeah, it's sort of akin to the notion of spirit. And realizing this aspect of ourselves is what sometimes is termed self-realization. We basically realize that we are divine, that we are this self, this spirit with a capital S. And then there's another term. As we're going from the extreme subtle to a grosser level life, a term called jiva. Jiva is now a more reified form of self. It is still subtle. I mean, the physical body is gross level. And it's the residual, it's basically the container, the vehicle for our subtle karmic imprints. It holds the tendencies or the samskaras, the imprints of like the actions we've done in the past that lead to the fruits in the future, the karma phala, kama vipaka, karma phala. I think if we haven't talked about that yet, we will, I think. We'll talk about karma. And basically, the karmic seeds are carried within this residual stuff. In some traditions, it's almost like there's soot on the soul or on the spirit, right? The spirit is encased in soot. And I think that's in the Jain tradition. Mahavira talks about the sooty quality of karmic residue that covers the soul. I mean, that covers the spirit. So jiva is more akin to soul. So we have spirit in the form of Atman, we have soul that is distinct. Now, some texts interchange these words. So if you get confused, don't worry. BKS Iyengar, when we read the Yoga Sutras, Light on the Yoga Sutras, he uses the word soul, I think, for what we might call spirit. So it can be a little confusing. But the main thing is to know where each author is coming from. What is their terminology? And so we'll sort of keep track of those things. Here we have a yogi, an ascetic. You can tell that this person is also fasting. This is part of a purification ritual. It's not a photograph, don't worry. It's an artist's rendering.
Not me.
It's not Tajay. Although he has this in his heart, I know. But this is basically an image trying to convey the spirit of how the ascetic path of deep, deep meditation, exploration of consciousness is actually part of the cosmos. That's the significance that it has. Mastery over the body, the impulses, the tendencies, purification through fasting and heat-building practices we call tapas, which, by the way, are not the Spanish delicacies that we find at Dali down the street. So we fast forward here, and I debated, do we do Buddha first? Do we do Patanjali first? I decided to do Patanjali first, largely because, first of all, there's some disagreement as to who Patanjali was, and there were several Patanjalis, and we're not sure who did what here with the Yoga Sutras, but the main focus here isn't so much trying to get to the truth, as insofar as it is trying to get to the accuracy of what this mysterious figure Patanjali was trying to codify, who took a lot of these various practices and systematized them into the eightfold path, the 8 limbs of yoga. So we think that this Patanjali was around the 2nd century BCE, anywhere up until the 4th century CE. So that's a 600-year spread, depending on which Patanjali did what, right? But largely, the point here was systematizing these esoteric teachings leading to enlightenment. And the main thing, and this is right at the very early part of the first pada, and we haven't gotten there yet. We're going to be reading the 4 padas of the Yoga Sutras. Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha. Yoga is the cessation of all fluctuations of the mind. In other words, cessation of the consciousness that is flip-flopping all over the place is the goal, and this is what leads to self-realization. Basically, the Atman within. Enlightenment. The ultimate nature, unifying with Brahman. So this is what became the endeavor here, was not just finding Atman, but realizing that in doing so, I am unifying with the Absolute, with Brahman itself, himself, herself, itself. So what does the path to liberation look like in yoga? And we'll be reading about these, but this is just kind of a summary. This time last year, I got to this slide and had only done half of them and didn't realize it till I was talking. It was kind of amusing. It's like, wait a minute, where's the other 4? What's going on here? The point here, and I added this phrase at the beginning, is that the 8 limbs of yoga, as systematized by Patanjali, they arise out of an ecosystem, and I'm big on this word ecosystem, designed to facilitate freedom from samsara. The freedom part we call moksha, or liberation. Moksha, you do find that in some Buddhist texts as well. But the ecosystem part, it's not just, oh, I'm going to get a book, go sit on a cushion and read my way into freedom, but that it comes with this process, whether we want to call it a religion, a science, a philosophy, a practice. There are elements of all of these things to yoga. And the 8 limbs really outline a path here. Yama, ethical principles and behavior, self-restraints. That begins to lay a foundation for a sincere way of living within the world that basically fosters the work to come. Niyama, observances, disciplined action. And then we get to where many yoga teachers begin, with asana. Asana, posture, pose, is basically this term proprioception. Has anybody heard this term? Proprioception. Basically experiencing your body, the physicality of your body in a place and time. That you are here, you are embodied, you're in a space, and you're here now. So what this really means is you're engaging intentionally in postures that facilitate the process of awakening. Asana originally really was about the lotus position. So it was about sitting on a cushion with your spine upright, your knees slightly lower than your sit bones, your legs crossed, your hands on your knees, on your legs, most likely in some kind of mudra, which have different symbolisms. And part of the reason for this is to keep the body prepared for deep, deep states. Now, we're talking about ascetics who spend hours and hours a day meditating. So imagine if you don't take care of your body, what happens? It starts to atrophy. You start having issues, I guess. So the body has to be strong to do this work. It needs to be purified as well. So here we're talking about rooting the body in gross level awareness and creating a really stable, healthy foundation for subtle mind states. That also means flowing energy. The energy process, the subtle physiology of the body, relying on a good posture so that the energy flowing through the channels has free flowing. The chakras, the wheels of energy within the different parts of the body can also be free flowing. And if they're blocked, well, then we work with freeing those up. So the early Upanishads that talk about chakras, they only named maybe 3 or 4 originally. And then as more exploration happened, then there were others that were added. But asana was really about that sense of stability, presence. And then as the asana part of yoga began to become more sophisticated with different postures, facilitating outcomes, learning from the physical body, what's called paksha, pratipaksha. Has anybody heard this? Paksha means direction. So if I'm doing like a warrior pose and I'm leaning out this way, then that's paksha, and then pratipaksha, the counterbalance, pulling me back this way so I find the center within the body and I find the stability. And then there were other postures that evolved from there. We're not going to go much more into those, but this is asana, a very important part of this path, so that the next one, pranayama, begins to now flow the energies through the body in a really wholesome way. Pranayama, breathing practices, exercises. Doing what's called kumbhaka in the Yoga Sutras, breath retention, where you breathe in and then you hold your breath. You hold it as long as you can and then you breathe out. And that retention of your breath, usually the mind is still. When you're holding your breath, you're probably not thinking. And what arises in that space, the space, what we can call the space between the in-breath and the out-breath, or the next in-breath, you get more in touch with awareness, with consciousness. not thinking, not doing, but observing witness consciousness. So that was one of the breathing techniques. There are others, chakra breathing, that also then evolved. Things like three-part breath, ujjayi breathing, which we talked about last night in our class. And we'll look at those more later. So there we are fit in the body. The breath is facilitating a change in our experience, in our consciousness, so that we can withdraw the senses inward, pratyahara, what we can call interoception. Proprioception was being aware of this body in this external space. Interoception now is being aware of my internal space. Withdrawing the senses inward, basically reclaiming all of that outward directed focus, that energy that we put with our consciousness out into the world, or as in Buddhism we call it the outward directed mind. We are now gathering all of that back so that we can basically reclaim the energy and come back into the space that we are in. Our senses are focused on the practice only. Then we're able to cultivate the next stage, dharana, concentrative stillness, where there is still a fluctuating mind, right? The mind is still dancing around, trying to lead us off down here, there, and everywhere. And so dharana is understood as a retrieval process. We're still working, trying to still the mind. But we are cultivating concentrative stillness to keep the mind present, much like shamatha in Buddhism. Once that happens, once the mind is stable, and we're able to abide more effortlessly in a state of clear observing, this is what we call dhyana, or meditation. Basically, the distractions have settled, we're able to observe, and rather than cultivating stillness, we're actually abiding in silence. Things are quiet. They're not just still, but they're quiet. There's an easefulness about the quiet. So by this point, we're moving from working with the mind to abiding within the underlying nature of mind, so that we can begin to experience that which is beyond ourselves. And in yoga, the term samadhi, which we will see also in Buddhism, we basically have concentrated the mind to a point where we have freed ourselves to be unified with the absolute, unifying with Brahman. We are no longer have a self. We no longer are distinct suffering beings, but we are resting in the absolute bliss of Brahman. So this is sort of how the 8 limbs carry us forward into what we call liberation or freedom. And yes, we can talk about, is this a permanent state, or do we flip-flop back and forth? Yeah, we flip-flop back and forth. And that's not to say this is easy. And it is a process of cultivation. Now we move into the 8th century CE. Now before this period, actually, there was what's called the 5th Veda, Vedanta. Anybody heard this term, Vedanta? Yeah. There was another tradition that was basically co-opted by the Brahmin caste in what's called the 6 darshanas, which is usually the priestly caste. When there was a new kind of upstart organization of monastics and ascetics saying this is the way to freedom, instead of arguing with them, the priestly caste would say, hey, that's a great idea. You now belong to us. Just gather it into the mothership. Now, they did not do that with Buddhism. Taji and I were having this conversation earlier. Why would they not do it with Buddhism? We're not going to answer that yet, as if we have a clear answer. But whereas the yoga tradition relies on duality, the earlier Samkhya philosophy of consciousness and matter, or Purusha and Prakriti, as we saw earlier, here there is a quality arising from the Upanishads of what we call non-duality, which we'll be looking at, I think, for next week or the week after. Advaita Vedanta. Advaita is a Sanskrit term for non-dual. Basically, no opposites. This is significant when we start looking at the Buddha's teachings, the middle path. And basically, it says that anything that has an opposite isn't true. The truth lies in between, in unity. And anything separate is an illusion. This became this tradition by largely promoted by Shankara or Shankaracharya. Charya means like leader, like Acharya is sort of a higher teacher. So Shankara is credited with a lot of the teachings of the Advaita Vedanta tradition that grew out of this Upanishadic period around the time that Buddhism was entering into Tibet during the 8th century. And again, here we have these three terms, Jiva, Atman, and Brahman. God realization. Realizing that I am Brahman, I am the divine, as are you, as are you, as are you. And the key here is recognizing when we are tempted to see that which is not us as being us. In other words, we take the illusory, the play, the Maya. Maya is illusion. That Brahman creates, the divine creates these illusions so that we can learn about who we are. But if we mistaken the nature of reality for the illusions, and we say, oh, this is real, then we suffer. We believe that we are more than we are, right? Asmita, the prideful ego, separation. And so part of that God realization or enlightenment is returning back to that understanding. Not just that I am Brahman, but that I am Nirguna Brahman. I am Brahman without form. So here we are again, self-realization in Advaita, and I will upload these slides so you'll have access to these. There's a phrase in Advaita, in the Vedanta, called Tattvam Asi, which means you are that. There is also terms neti, the word neti means not this. Neti neti, Tattvam Asi, not that, you are this. In other words, you are not the things that you cling to, grasp onto, as being who you really are. You are not the things of this world. You are not your thoughts. You are not the illusions that your mind is projecting into the world and receiving from the grand illusion provided by Brahman. But rather, you are that. You are that pure consciousness, love, bliss, Satchitananda, truth, consciousness, and bliss. And here Maya, the illusion of the world manifested by Brahman. So what is freedom in this? Well, freedom is number one, knowing the nature of self. And here we have capital S, which we will poke holes through that from the Buddhist lens. Not that it's right or wrong, but just when we look at it through another lens, we start seeing issues with this notion of self. Two, seeing through the truth of Maya, seeing illusory things to be as they are, illusory. Discernment, in other words. And three, identifying with the seer, as Iyengar calls it, or the witness consciousness, which in Sanskrit is called sakshin. Sakshin, pure neutral awareness that is awake, wakeful, watching, observing all things, not with any judgment, no form, but clear, present awareness. It is very, very refined. And in Advaita, we train to just simply abide in this witness consciousness. It is also bright, spacious, profound. Yeah? The longer we stay there, the more we're able to do number four, which is absorb into the absolute, into Brahman, because that is the nature of Brahman. That Sakshin is a part of Atman. And at that point, rather than seeing all things as the illusions that they appear to be, we instead see all things as a manifestation of Brahman. So we've kind of now come to the actual realization, the point of awakening. Oh boy, here we go. We're doing another turn. Now we enter the realm of Buddha. So we're backing up a bit from Shankaracharya in the 8th century CE back to 600 BCE. During this period in which the Upanishadic, the people who were composing, and again, these were passed down orally, these were not written texts until much later. But somewhere around the 6th century BCE, there was a prince. This is the story I love to tell. His name was Siddhartha Gautama. His father was King Shuddhodana. They were a small clan who ruled sort of a portion of southern Nepal, what is now southern Nepal, northern India. And so he was raised very privileged. As a prince, he had access to education, to learning how to fight, and medicine, all of those things, how to lead, most likely. And one day when he was coming back to the palace, he met 3 people on the road, or he saw them anyway. One was an old person, somebody who looked old and, pardon my word, decrepit. Sometimes I'm starting to feel decrepit, so I use that for myself too. All right, maybe not as much as I will in a few years, but anyway, and it moved him. Basically, he was moved by seeing this and had the thought, someday I will be like this too. Huh, okay. He then also met or saw a sick person. Now, if you've ever been to a region of the world where death is actually not hard to see, if you go to India, there are still areas, especially rural villages, where they burn bodies in charnel grounds. And there's often a smell of smoke from these burial sites and these charnel grounds. So I don't think it was uncommon for him to see illness, but something struck him in that moment, that this is actually also an experience of being in this human body and being alive. I too could be sick. He probably had been. And there are stories throughout the Buddhist teachings of the Buddha himself being ill. He was also called the great physician and knew a lot about remedies for illnesses to keep the body healthy and strong and all of that. And the third one was a corpse, a dead body on the side of the road. Someday I too will be dead. And that stuck with him. There was a seed planted there. Seeing all of these things as suffering, one night he left the palace. I have a sense, I don't know if you know, but he didn't tell anybody, he just left. And he met a 4th person, an enlightened being, somebody who he could learn from. The Buddha himself, as he was later called, at this point he was still Siddhartha, who began learning. There was, again, this period was an extraordinary period of exploring consciousness and traditions in different sects, different things. Anyway, he tried everything from what we now know to be the tantric path, which was excess. In order to learn how to master your temptations, you basically indulge them to an extreme level to learn how to overcome them. And he realized this is not the way. This is not helpful. He also did extreme asceticism. He became an extreme ascetic, starving himself, fasting, to the point where he got deathly ill. He almost died because of a lack of nutrition. And he was brought back by Sujata, a woman who gave him a mixture of rice and milk, and his body got healthy, he regained. So this is where we come to why Buddhism is sometimes called the middle path. These extremes are not the truth, but rather the truth lies in between. It lies in discerning the middle way. So often Buddhism is called the middle way. He went then and sat under a banyan tree, which we think was a banyan tree. These are the really cool. In fact, the Arnold Arboretum, I think, has 1 or 2 of them. These amazing, thick, big trees with gnarled roots above ground that almost provide shelter. Beautiful trees. And he sat there for 49 days and nights, decided, I'm not getting up until I'm awake. Was tempted, went through all kinds of mental processes. Mara, the nemesis, he's not really a devil, Mara, but he's kind of like the one challenging every accomplishment the Buddha made. Oh, you think you're calm now? Here, chew on this, right? Serpents, snakes, which he's in the wilderness. Of course, there are animals in the night. Temptations, sexual temptations rising. But he mastered his mind enough to be able to ride the waves and keep his clarity. So finally he emerged out from under the Bodhi tree. And when he was asked who he was, he said, I am awake. He encountered some of the old friends that he'd known back in the communities that he had been part of. Okay, that's a little too quick to get to that slide, but it's all right. And he began teaching. His first discourse was what we call the Four Noble Truths, that in fact life is dissatisfying because of the truth of change and impermanence. Here we see impermanence, the realization of impermanence arising. And the reason for the suffering is just that we so neurotically cling to the things that are hopelessly impermanent. We want this, we want that, we don't want this. This feels permanent. The bad stuff always feels permanent. The good stuff always feels like it slips away. And that discontentedness is suffering. And it happens because of the three poisons, what we call the three poisons, which is greed, right? Neediness, greed, aversion or hatred, just don't like this or that, and delusion or ignorance, seeing things not for what they really are. And there's a way out of this. The third noble truth, there is a way out. That way out is nibbana or nirvana, freedom from all the conditioned ways of thinking, the consciousness that ensnares us in desire and craving and aversion. And how do we get there? Eightfold path, 8 stages. Again, 8. And it's interesting to compare the 8 limbs of yoga to the 8 stages of the Noble Eightfold Path. I've tried to do that. It doesn't really work one-to-one, but it's kind of fun exercise to do. So Nirvana, he talks about freedom. What is freedom? And when we talk about this state of nirvana, we're talking about a state of fully unconditioned awareness. It's one way to talk about it. Basically, there is no more cause and conditions to the concepts, the illusions that we buy into. In fact, awareness itself is just free from all the things that contribute to that dissatisfactory state. So this is what the Buddha was concerned about. Freedom is freedom from the 3 poisons, from the clinging that leads to discontent, and includes insight into the nature of reality, that all things have no inherent self, quote unquote. This is a hard one for a lot of us. Perceiving reality just as it is, with full clarity, nothing in the way, like an open sky as opposed to a cloudy sky. Equanimity, an even mind that's not jumping all over the place, grasping this, hating that. No, neutrality that is engaged and present. Equanimity or equipoise. And penetrative insight, seeing into the nature of things, knowing reality to be as it is. This is actually something in Zen that is a priority. This term suchness, basically seeing everything clearly as it is without all those filters, without all the projections, just as it is. Thusness, another way to say it. Or emptiness, a very poor translation for the word shunyata. Shunyata often is translated as emptiness, but it's not empty of experience. Shunyata or emptiness, which we see a lot more in later traditions in Buddhism, is basically the union of profound openness without content, This is how I like to talk about it. Awareness that is just clear and profoundly open and luminous, bright, so clear that it shines, the brightly shining mind. So, some questions here. If we've read Somaratne's articles over the last couple of weeks, he uses the word emancipation. That's one term for freedom, which is the next one here. Emancipation or freedom or liberation. And the question is, from what? And by whom? Who is doing the emancipating and who is being emancipated? Who is the one freeing whom? Who is liberating whom? We're not supposed to answer. This is a rhetorical question. And if you're confused about that, it's okay. That's the path, is trying to see, what is this path about? Good question. Who am I? And who is me as not me, but free? Okay, so when we look at awakening in Buddhism, these are just some thoughts here. So what do we mean when we talk about awakening in Buddhism? So we've talked about emancipation, which is freedom from something. Liberation, also freedom from some kind of bondage, perhaps. So that those terms really point to the bondage aspect. This term Bodhi, B-O-D-H-I, I think that's the only name for the mind the Buddha had. Isn't that right? For this state. Are you okay?
I'm yawning. No one saw it.
You're yearning?
Yawning.
Oh.
No one saw it.
Bodhi, awake. Bodhi tree, the tree under which the Buddha sat, which you can visit in Bodh Gaya, India. The tree of awakening, basically. Bodhicitta, mind of awakening, which is through compassion. The heart, mind here is also heart. After all, consciousness in these traditions is said to originate not from the brain, but from here, from the heart. This is the source of consciousness, not the brain. And interestingly, neurocardiology is a new field, sort of straddling neuroscience, that shows neurons, 40,000 different types of neurons in the heart specifically. So it may not be so far-fetched that our consciousness arises from here, as opposed to the processing unit of the brain that does stuff with the consciousness. We'll look more at that later, but Bodhi through mindfulness. Sati, the Pali word sati, the Sanskrit for that is smrti, means memory or remembering. The text that we cover in the other course in the fall, mindfulness, we read that text, we go in depth into how we cultivate mindfulness, but largely within mindfulness leading to nirvana. In fact, the Buddha says, this is his 10th discourse, he talks about sati being the only path that you need for the cessation of suffering, lamentation and sorrow, and the attainment of nibbana, or nirvana. This term nibbana, with the two B's, is just a Pali way of saying nirvana, which is the Sanskrit. So using body, feelings, and thoughts as the place of transforming suffering into freedom through insight, which is the fourth foundation of mindfulness, also known as vipassana, or insight practice, insight meditation, into the nature of reality. These are the four foundations of mindfulness. What are we getting insight into? Well, the nature of impermanence of all things, why we suffer, and what part of us does not suffer. What are the qualities of not suffering? Well, the qualities of progressing towards nibbana, the 7 factors of awakening. So he has this path that on the very 10th, his 10th lecture, Dharma talk, whatever we want to call it, where he really outlines the practice of mindfulness leading to insight and wisdom. Another way to think about awakening in Buddhism, something we talk about a lot in Tibetan Buddhism, the tradition that I teach and practice in, is gathering the mind back to the original source of that mind. Gathering the mind. The concept of no self, or anatta. Atta is the Pali word for self, anatta, no self. We'll be looking at all of this, by the way. So I'm just kind of running through some of these core themes here around awakening. Shunyata, this word that I mentioned a moment ago, emptiness, which I prefer to translate, actually there is no translation for it, because it's pointing us to an ineffable quality, and emptiness really is a misnomer for this quality. Some people call it voidness. That's even worse. It's great if you're a nihilist. Nothing exists. That is not what shunyata means. It is profound. My take on this. Shunyata is profound openness without content. It is a clear, pristine, spacious awareness that has nothing within it. No projections into it. No conceptual understandings. It's just pure open awareness. Luminosity, another quality also in Tibetan Buddhism, very important quality. Consciousness is deeply refined, like refining gold. Mind is seen like rough ore, and you work it until it is shining like gold, refined into gold. That's one way that it's talked about. Into an experience of clear, open awareness. Formlessness and form. Seeing form, experiencing formlessness. Form is emptiness, emptiness is form. Has anybody heard this? Basically, what we take to be real forms, we see as empty of any kind of inherentness to it. Like Chris, this thing here. Where is Chrisness in me? Where are you going to find it? If you start pulling me apart, my cells, my organs, not only would that be gross, but you're not going to find Chrisness. What makes Chris? It's temporary. So there is no essence of Chris here. There's an aggregate of processes, of things, conditions, genetics, epigenetics, patterns, habits, fine. Those are all going to go away. Thank God, at some point. I'm kidding. I'm grateful for my life. Please don't get me wrong. There is also an aspect to me that is formless. And the amount of years I have spent abiding in that wonderful state, I can attest to a lot of what we're learning here as being true. Compassion, what's called basic goodness, that this is a quality inherent, one of the more inherent traits is altruism, compassion. It doesn't seem that way when you look out at the world or you think about people who have done us harm in some way, but that doesn't mean that basic goodness is lacking. It means that there's an awful lot of other stuff that has been piled on top of it that we can't get to it any longer. So this is a presupposition in Buddhism that this is really our essence. And compassion here is really that responsiveness to suffering through empathy, and it joins with wisdom and skillful means. In other words, we see suffering not from a place of condescension, but saying, yes, I get it. I know what suffering feels like. I understand the helplessness that comes with suffering. Nobody wants to suffer. And I'm moved to help. I'm moved to be there with you. Even if you're attacking me, it may not be good for me, fine, I'll go somewhere else. But still, my motivation is really about easing suffering, no matter what I encounter. Now, we have a whole class on that in the spring, so on compassion. So we're not going to go much further with that. But largely, compassion relies on wisdom and skillful means, doing what is necessary, including Fierce compassion. Compassion is not just soft, vulnerable, hey, it's all good, but sometimes it has a force to it. It sets boundaries, but not out of judgment, out of you're a bad person, but rather, this doesn't work. This isn't wholesome. Let's find another way. So these are qualities, anyway, that we can associate here with this term awakening, which implies awakening out of something, a state of slumber, of sleep, of dreaming, the dream state. In the Lojong teachings, in mind training, one of the instructions is see all things as dreamlike. And when you see it as a dream, okay, then you're gaining some truth into it. So what else is there besides the dream? There is awareness. There is discernment, wisdom. Okay. Now, with Buddhism, it can get complex. And I think probably starting next week, or maybe I'm almost finished here, we can start talking a little bit about classical early Buddhism. But it's also important to articulate how Buddhism then splintered off into many different traditions. Here, we're going to talk about 4. And what was sort of a later manifestation of the early Buddhist community is what we call Theravada Buddhism. We have 2 people here who basically represent that tradition. Here we have a monk, a Theravada monk. And Tajay used to be a Theravada monk, was raised in the monastery. And so, forgive me if I don't get this right, but largely, this is a tradition that really focuses on the Pali Canon, the early teachings of the Buddha in the Pali language. It's very much focused on texts, authoritative texts, and largely monastic, really, in kind of the cultivation of Dharma. The principal enlightened being is what's called the Arahant. This is a realized person who has basically become enlightened. 2 of the practice parts of this are samatha, calm abiding by focused attention, and vipassana, insight meditation, to realize not just how to calm the mind, but how to put it into perspective and see what causes suffering and how to be liberated. The jhanas, which we'll be looking at, the absorptions, this is a process of cultivations, meditations, that out of which each stage takes us to a much higher, more refined place. And samapati, these are experiences beyond the absorptions that Tajay will speak more about. Did I do justice to Theravada in the last 2 minutes? Is that even possible? Well, what else would you add about Theravada Buddhism?
Monty?
No.
Generosity, humility. What do you think, Tajay?
Yeah, that's good.
Is it okay? All right, we'll move on. So you basically find this tradition primarily in places like Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, what used to be called Burma, now it's Myanmar, Thailand, Cambodia. Theravada's in Cambodia, I believe. Where else do we find most? Laos. Right. Interestingly, I believe in Nepal there are some Theravada communities as well. Yes. Which is interesting because that's also Mahayana country. But Nepal is very unique in that way with the multiplicity of religions. So basically, as it originated out of the Himalayan, the northern Indian context, and spread, it was purged out of India. Buddhism was largely purged for quite a long time. Now it's making a resurgence. But we have another tradition, lineage, or it's actually many lineages, what's called Mahayana Buddhism. Maha, great, Yana, vehicle. So seen to be translated as greater vehicle. Personally, I think that Theravada is a great vehicle on its own. And there have been debates that go all the way back. Who's right? All these apologetics, which are utterly nonsense, in my opinion. That's my opinion. But Mahayana Buddhism, you find largely in its early roots also in India, that found its way to Tibet in the 8th century with the great guru Padmasambhava, who was a master and a meditation teacher. I could say a lot about him. He's a central part of my practice. And the book we're going to read, the autobiography of the great wisdom queen, Yeshe Tsogyal, she was his partner and student. She was a princess who basically sloughed off the whole world of being a princess and required to get married to a prince. She had no interest in that. She instead went into the mountains and found Padmasambhava and studied with him, and then took his teachings and hid them in caves and in different places. She's the reason we have his teachings, because those were then also revealed. Anyway, Padmasambhava, Yeshe Tsogyal, an interesting couple, power couple, if you will, in the Tibetan plateau. So what are the themes here? Mahayana Buddhism also actually made its way before that in the 6th century to China, where we have Chan, which is a derivative of the word dhyana. Remember the 8 limbs? We had dhyana was meditation. So dhyana, pronounced in the Chinese as Chan, and that fused with Taoism and Confucianism before it spread to Japan and became Zen. Zen is Chan. It's just pronounced in the Japanese as Zen. But largely the roots of Chan in China, also part of the whole Taoist framework. So you have this sort of influx, confluence of these traditions, really quite remarkable in pre-communist China. You also have in China a Pure Land, what's called Pure Land Buddhism, where the name of Amitabha Buddha is chanted, Namo Amitofo. Guan Yin, who is the embodiment of great compassion. Temples that are geared towards revering. Nowadays, not so much, but people still practice Buddhism there. Yeah. Anyway, Taiwan, you have a lot of that in Hong Kong. So anyway, you can see kind of how Buddhism, the Mahayana version of it, spread into East Asia, Central Asia, from South Asia, where it was then purged. A lot of our texts in Mahayana are preserved in the Chinese, and so are in the process of being retranslated back into English. But there are also quite a number of them in the Tibetan as well. And the idea here in Mahayana Buddhism, anyone can practice. You don't have to be a monastic. The central themes here are the figure of the Bodhisattva, or the enlightened being, who cultivates compassion, a sincere desire to be of benefit. What's called lamrim is a Tibetan word. It means the gradual path. It's that you endeavor over many lifetimes to continue cultivating Dharma, paying homage to the Buddha, doing your observances, chanting, that kind of thing. And reciting mantra as well. And shamatha practice. Shamatha, again, as in the Theravada, calm abiding through concentrative attention. Now, there's a lot more we could say. Here's a picture here of the yellow hats. This is the Gelugpa tradition from the Dalai Lama's lineage. There are many lineages of Mahayana, of Tibetan Buddhism in Mahayana. And one of them is now a third branch. This is a third branch of Buddhism, but it's really part of Mahayana, what we call Vajrayana. This is the Tantric Buddhist path that largely has taken a lot of its teachings from the earlier tantras of the yogic systems, of the Kashmiri system, the Shaivite tradition, Vaishnava, tantras. Tantrika is a tantric practitioner The yogas here are geared towards enlightenment in one lifetime if you apply yourself. And therefore, the realization of shunyata, this word that we call emptiness, the union of shunyata and luminosity together in one experience that is also imbued with the right motivation of compassion, leading to a realization of rigpa. This is a Tibetan word for ground luminosity or profound awareness. Now, there are a couple of different ways to go in Vajrayana. There are many different lineages here. Ati Yoga, Ati means extraordinary. It's the pinnacle of Tantric Buddhist practice to realize basically the ultimate nature of your, of your awareness, to realize the union of emptiness and luminosity. Dzogchen, another lineage from a different, a practice from a different, actually that is Ati Yoga, great perfection. Mahamudra, another one. So we're going to revisit these. We're just kind of laying scaffolding here. Mahamudra, great gesture is what it means. That is part of a different lineage called the Kagyu Buddhist lineage. Now, a lot of these overlap. People who've been in monastic training as Nyingma or Dzogchen monks or nuns will also be in the monastery with Kagyu. So there's a lot of overlap. And in the West, we tend to sort of parse everything out. But in reality, there's a lot of overlap here. And it also focuses on Guru Yoga, basically that your teacher is an embodiment of the Buddha himself. Now, this can get problematic for other reasons, because not all teachers have the student's best interests at heart. And we've seen this around sexual boundary violations. And this is true in every religious tradition that I can think of, where you have improprieties happening and damage done. But anyway, this is a foundation that you basically see your guru akin to the Buddha. You basically entrust your entire being to this person because they have traveled the path and they have the wisdom and the skillful means. And then finally, as I mentioned a moment ago, Zen in Japan or Chan in China, Buddhism, which really strips things down to focus just on the mind itself. Now, the different cultures, Zen being part, or Chan being part of China, Zen being part of Korea, Vietnam, Japan, now the West, is very popular here in the West since the 50s, focusing on what's called Buddha nature, the ultimate underlying nature of the Buddha mind that is within you, that is possible to encounter through the Eightfold Path. Zazen, a Japanese word for sitting meditation, that's the hallmark of the practice. There is also chanting that is done. Another school, mind only, it basically sees the mind as the place of transformation and as the source of suffering. And so a lot of it has to do with sitting until you recognize the underlying nature of the mind itself. Another term, satori. Has anybody heard this one? Satori. That is a period of realization. Often it's temporary. It can happen spontaneously, what's called sudden enlightenment. This is recognized in Zen as being a possibility. There's a freshness to meditation once you realize that you're not trying to make or create an artificial experience, but you're allowing yourself simply to open in this moment to the realization of the underlying nature of your mind, what's called sudden enlightenment, but it's not necessarily permanent. We'll be seeing this also with in the classical Buddhism, that there's temporary enlightenment and there's longer lasting forms of it. But here it's it's that you have a flash of insight. It may linger for 5 minutes or 5 weeks. So I personally have had experiences similar to this, where I come off of a retreat that has been really profound and deep, and it stays with me for weeks afterwards, even as I try to live my ordinary life again. Other hallmarks of this, something called dokusan in Japanese. Basically, that means you are interviewing with your teacher. You have a real teacher, and you sit with them, and they basically will counsel you one-on-one. That's something that's really lost in a lot of cases. It takes time, right? Unless you're in a community, and that's what the teacher's there to do. And it's very traditional. You meet with your teacher one-on-one and discuss where you are, what kinds of practices are necessary, what kinds of obstacles are you coming up against. And as part of that too, what's called a koan practice. I think in the Chinese it's kung an, in the Mandarin, kung an, not positive, but koan is a phrase like, what is the sound of one hand clapping? What is the sound of one hand clapping? What do you think? How would you answer that if you were asked by your master? You can unmute, you can, what do you think?
Traumatized from third grade when people would ask this question.
What's that?
I'm traumatized from third grade when people would ask this question.
You know, that's a good answer. No, it is.
Compassion comes to mind because two hands clapping is resisting or challenging or engaging, and one hand doesn't make a sound, essentially. So by
Okay.
not fighting it or challenging it, but embracing it, the word compassion comes to mind.
Well, let me tell you why your master would hit you with a cane
Go for it.
for that answer, which they still do, by the way, in some cultures. And they don't do it very hard. It's not meant to harm you. It's meant to wake you up. Because you gave a very rational, logical answer, yeah? And part of the endeavor here around things like this, or if a tree falls in the forest and no one is around to hear it, does it make a sound? These are incomprehensible. They're meant to tie up your mind so you finally let go of the logic and the rational mind and answer the question with something that is actually real in this moment. So what you said, and I'm not playing favorites here, by the way. I think you gave a great answer. But what he said was, it reminds me of, that's the important part. It's an experience you're having right now, an experience of truth. You could also just as well have said the clouds. It's a cloudy night. That would have been a good answer. Why? Because you can speak to it. It's actually happening. It's mindful of what is there in this moment. Does a dog have Buddha nature? What was beautiful, last year we had two people get into a debate right here in the classroom around this question. And while they were debating, I went over to the whiteboard and I did this. Everybody jumped, stopped. That got them right out of their heads into an immediacy of the moment through their senses of startle. That is a moment of potential. That was real. All the fabrication, and I'm not saying you were fabricating anything, by the way. I don't mean that. But that was trying to convey the truth of the moment in a split second. This is why koans are deceptively deep and yet quite simple if you know I don't want to say if you know the secret to them, but you want to speak to what your experience is of this moment. Like, oh, the tea kettle is whistling, or the air is going. I mean, you can speak to these things, right? But you see how quickly the mind wants to make a spin out of it and figure out the answer from a different part of our mind. It's kind of cool, right? So what is enlightenment? Conclusions, questions. We don't have to do this. But I do think it probably serves us a bit to check in. I think I did this for a Zoom presentation. That's why this slide is here. So what do you think? That's quite a story, isn't it? That's a lot of ideas, a lot of concepts, One of my teachers once said, and it is all utter nonsense. Why would she say that? After all that. It brings us back to the ineffable thing. It brings us back to something that Ricard and Singer talk about. A couple of our authors, I think Thich Nhat Hanh talks about it in today's reading too. The difference between conventional or relative truth and ultimate truth. And from a conventional standpoint, it's not that it's an illusion, it's that we have to see through it skillfully to see what it is. The ultimate reality, however, the forms, these are just concepts that we can get attached to and get drawn into. So we have to be able to relinquish the raft. That's another way to say it, at some point. So we use the relative skillfully to reach certain places in our evolution of our consciousness. But we also have to put it into perspective that the finger, as Billy is saying, the finger that is pointing at the moon is not the moon, and yet we take the finger to be the moon. We take that to be the point and miss the moon altogether. Does that make sense?